Thanks for joining us and welcome back. We are diving into a new book in our series on wisdom literature this week with the book of Job. As we usually do, we're going to start with a general overview to put this book into some context for us. And so we're pretty sure that Job was written sometime around the 6th century BCE. There's nothing in the book such as during the time of such and such king, and so there's really no internal language that tells us the time for this book, but there are a lot of details about how it's written, the language that's used, the cultural references and allusions to places and events that pin it down to right around the 6th century BCE. We get a range from scholars between 7th and 4th century. The setting itself, however, is, if we read very carefully and compare it to the different time periods of Israelite history and whatnot, the story itself is actually set about 600 years earlier in the time of patriarchal Israel. So examples are like the possessions that Job has, the monetary system that's referenced, all kind of set it in the context of early biblical stories, like those from Abraham to Moses. It's the patriarchal era. We don't really know where this is written. Part of the dilemma is if the scholars are right and we're placing this in the 6th century, it could be written in Babylon during the exile. It could also be written in Jerusalem after the exile, or it could be written in a number of other places. The book itself kind of suggests it's written somewhere around southern Edom, which would put it as outside and foreign to Israel. But we're pretty sure that the author is Israelite, and some of the nuances in the Hebrew and the way it's written that try to make Job seem like it's written outside of Israel, written with some kind of foreign element, scholars believe actually were done intentionally to make it seem foreign or exotic, rather than being reflections of an author that's normally accustomed to writing in a different language, who's instead writing in Hebrew. It's interesting that it would seem the author wants to intentionally give us the sense of some kind of exotic or foreign source in the story. Let's see, did I miss anything really important? What we talked about this briefly before when we had our Bible study series, whatever, on who is this figure, Satan in Scripture, and we're going to meet that figure again here in Job. And what's interesting is we have sort of an in-between figure. In early Israelite history, we might get allusions to this figure. It's just somebody who does accusing on behalf of God. Here, the Satan figure gets fleshed out a little more, but it's not yet the Zoroastrian dualism, anti-God figure that we come to know in the modern red suit, red horns, pitchfork devil figure that we have today. So, and that fits in with the scholarship that dates this around that 6th century BCE. Another key thing, and I think we're going to, as far as how we read Job, I'm going to suggest that on this go through, we're gonna read this book a little differently than one might if they just sit down and read the book of Job, because those who believe that human hands have been able to alter or influence Scripture suggest that Job is one of the books that has some pretty large additions to it. And there's two key areas where this comes about. The first is in chapters 32 through 39. All of that, some scholars argue, has been added. The reason for that is because, and we'll see this right away when we get to chapter 2, chapter 2 has a place where the story says, "Now, when Job's 3 friends heard all these troubles, They had come upon him. Each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamhite. Okay, so 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. When we get to chapter 3, all of a sudden there'll be a guy named Elihu, who's not one of those 3, who just suddenly appears out of nowhere and has a whole bunch of things to say that are completely different than the rest of the book. And then as soon as he's done talking, after 7, 8 chapters, 8 chapters, all of a sudden God will answer Job, who just finished talking right before Elihu goes on this long tirade. It just kind of just pops in the middle there, out of nowhere. Somewhere this 4th figure shows up who's never mentioned. Anyway, the argument is that this is a scribal edition, or somebody's effort to intentionally reshape the book of Job. The second is at the very end of the book. There is a section from 42:10 on where it's called the restoration of Job's fortune. Job, it's sort of it's like the old joke about what do you get if you play the country western song backwards? You get your dog back, you get your wallet back, you get your wife back, you get your truck back. You haven't done that one, eh?
I've never heard that.
So, it's an old joke, but at the end of the story, Job gets everything back. He gets back his family and his livestock and his fortunes and everything. The general consensus in scholarship is those passages are added in after the fact, because if we read Job without this, there's a certain discomfort that we're left with at the end of the story. The argument is we're actually supposed to be left with that discomfort, and there's good reasons for it. And I'm just gonna go ahead and talk about them right now, because the theme we want to look at, there's 2 ways to read Job. We can read it with the additions added in, or we can read it without the additions. If we read it with the additions, what we basically get is a book about Job who has some stuff happen in his life, and everything about the world seems out of order and disrupted, and nothing makes sense. And in the end, along comes a guy who we don't know, who just randomly appears out of nowhere, who says, by the way, everything in the world does make sense. You're an idiot for all this time for having thought that it didn't make sense. I don't know why you even told this story. And then God pops in, has a few words, and everything gets worked out in the end, and the story is meaningless, essentially. If we take these additions out of the story, we get a story that is much more similar to Ecclesiastes, where it sort of presents us with the realism of reality. Sometimes things in life don't work out the way we expect them to. The idea of wisdom doesn't always pan out perfectly like the rules of a game, right? And in Job's case, we're experiencing that, and we get to experience it with him. Life doesn't seem to make sense. Of course, unlike Ecclesiastes, we get God who speaks at the end, who says, essentially, you're not God. Why would you think you would understand everything that God does? Why do you think you could fathom the mysteries of the whole universe? And that kind of presents the story with its climax. It's essentially Job, without the additions, becomes a challenge to traditional wisdom literature. That says, where traditional wisdom literature says, we can figure out everything, and if we can just come up with the right equation, the right rules, the right laws, then all the bad people always lose and suffer and get punished, and all the good people always get rewarded, and everything works out perfectly. We just haven't figured out the perfect wisdom yet. So, anybody can pick up the Bible and read Job straight through anytime they want. I'm going to suggest that for our Bible study, we're going to read it without the additions, and then we're going to go back, and we can read the additions separately and then ask, how does that change what we just read? Now that's not going to hit us for a couple weeks, because that, like I said, none of that happens until chapter 32. So by the time we get there, we'll have half forgotten that and can sort of wrestle with that when we get there. So with that said, without further ado, could someone read for us chapter 1?
I can.
Okay.
There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And then, when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Whence have you come?" Satan answered to the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, who fears God and turns away from evil?" Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for naught? Hast thou not put a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth thy hand now, and touch all that he has, and he will curse thee to thy face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only upon himself do not put forth your hand." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest son's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 companies and made a raid upon the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you." And Job arose and rent his robe and shaved his head and fell upon the ground and worshipped, and he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And all of this Job did not sin or charge God with wrong.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, pretty rough to be Job, right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Anything jump out or any questions? So there's a couple interesting things. So we read in translation Satan, and really in the Hebrew it says the Satan, which is a word that means accuser. So really, when we're reading this, it says, so for example, verse 6, "One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser also came among them." Right? So it's not yet a name; it's just a title. And we often get this with descriptions of God's court. We get legalistic language. We get accusers and defenders and witnesses. The Bible has a lot of that language in it. So here he's an accuser. He seems to have a job in God's court of going out throughout the world and finding people who are bad, and then going to God and saying, by the way, there's this person who's bad. You need to punish him. Today, the accuser has taken on a different role and has decided to say, here's a guy who isn't bad, but you know what, I think there's a reason for that. Which is fascinating because a lot of the concepts that we address today when we talk about morality and ethics and behavior, all of a sudden kind of come into this story out of the blue. We get issues of relativism that are being presented. We get issues of motivation. Why do people believe in God? What is their motivation? What is their belief justified on or built upon? And also privilege. Job is very privileged. Everything in his life has been perfect up until now because God has basically, as the accuser suggests, put a fence around him, protected him from everything that could ever happen to him. He's had about as perfect of a life as a human being can have. And so the accuser suggests, if you didn't protect him so much, he wouldn't behave the same way. We are presented with a very faithful character in Job, and we get this interesting idea here early on where he says, it says at the end of the day he goes and he makes an offer to offer burnt offerings according to the number of his children, because he says to himself, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Of course, just in their hearts, so he wouldn't even know about it. And so that's why Job makes these extra offerings, right? Like, just to make sure, just to cover all bases. Like that's how faithful he is. And what's interesting is we have, and it's written later, but we have the book of Tobit, which is not officially the Bible, it's in the Apocrypha, that we looked at before. And if you remember, Tobit gets a similar suggestion from the angel. Now, Tobit's not quite as perfect of a person as Job. He's done something wrong in the past, and we're not really clear about what that was. But there's a big question in Tobit of, well, what should I do about my family? What if they sin? How? And of course, Tobit's answer is different. The angel tells Tobit, you need to go hurry up and tell them what you've seen in this vision so that they can turn their lives around. Whereas Job is trying to make amends for them as a precursor to any risk, right? He's preempting any damage. Just going to take care of it, just in case. I think it's worth noting in chapter 1 how many, well, not necessarily how many, but that we have 7 sons, 3 daughters, a lot of animals, a lot of servants. All of them are dead by the end of chapter 1, right? Well, except for these 4 servants who are the messengers who somehow survive, right? To survive, to tell the story. And that sort of sets up our context. But at the end of the day, having lost just about everything, Job does not sin or charge God with any wrongdoing, right? He takes it in stride, which is almost ridiculous, but maybe there is such a person out there who could literally lose their job, their livelihood, all of their family, all of their friends, all of their servants. I guess we don't really have to deal with losing servants, but essentially this is a guy who's just lost he was worth $6 billion and he just lost $5.999 billion and all of his family and servants and animals.
It doesn't say anything about his wife, though.
It does not say anything about his wife. So the wife's still around. Maybe the accuser felt like that was a punishment.
Or, as we read before, wives.
Yeah. Is it wives?
No.
Okay.
Does it say wife?
I think my recollection is he has just one wife, but I don't recall.
It doesn't say in this
They're
chapter.
born to him, it doesn't say.
Okay. I don't know if the wife is or wives are mentioned in here or not. I don't recall.
Well, when I read this first chapter today, after this description, I'm thinking, okay, this author had a very straightforward and simple message he wanted to get across to his audience, and that is your faith should be not determined by your position or your fortunes in life. And so he's setting out to do that.
That's definitely the setup of the story, right?
Okay, and I've always thought that about Job. It's going to be interesting as we go through this intellectually whether there's a lot more subtle stuff going on.
There's a whole lot more going on, but if we stop at chapter 1, that's absolutely where we end up. Job is faithful. Job has lost everything. Job remains faithful. Oh look, he's a great servant. Story's not done yet, though. The accuser has something yet to say about this. So would someone pick up in chapter 2 and see where this takes us?
I'll do that. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "Whence have you come?" Satan answered, by the way, why does he repeat here? I mean, this is the same text as before. It changes later on, but the Lord said to Satan, "Whence have you come?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? That there is none like him on earth, a blameless, upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you moved me against him to destroy him without cause." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But put forth thy hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power, only spare his life." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord, and afflicted Job with loathsome sores, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd, I don't know what that is, with which to scrape himself, and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this Job did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz and Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Nemathite. They made an appointment together to come to condole with him and comfort him. And when they saw him from afar, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept. And they rent their robes and sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days, 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great.
Thank you. Okay, potsherd. Potsherd is a piece of broken pottery.
Okay.
In the ancient world, especially in the Middle East, broken pottery was not thrown away. It was often used as paper, so people would scribe or write on broken pieces of pottery. We have lots of examples of that. And it was reused for other things, so they didn't waste. So, and it's really fascinating because it's one of the best ways we have to get an approximate date on an archaeological dig site if we don't have something more concrete, like the wood record from the rings of trees can date pretty accurately because we've built up a system for measuring that, or measuring the carbon decay for carbon dating. So potsherds are a great example of it. But so that's what he did. He scraped his skin. He scraped his sores.
Broke a piece of glass.
Yeah, well, ceramic. Not quite as sharp as glass, but yes. And you had asked, why does it open the same way? Why does it repeat so much of the text? This is really common up until relatively modern era, that stories are that established patterns are always spelled out in full detail. For one, it kind of sets up the sense that the Lord's court has a consistent function, a consistent pattern, the way things are happening. But it's also just part of the writing tradition from the time period. Our modern idea of kind of truncating things to kind of get on with the story, like, this
You
thing,
already went over.
we already did this, is not yet established. But yeah, so we're presented with the accuser makes an interesting argument, right? Like, person can lose anything, but as long as it's not themselves. I mean, essentially, he's doubling down, right? First, he goes to God and says, "Yeah, the only reason Job's faithful is because you've protected him all of his life. He's had such a perfect life." And when Job is afflicted with losses and still doesn't turn from God, the accuser's response is, "Well, that's because Job is actually greedier than I originally thought, because he'd give anything for his own life. So as long as he's got his life in his skin, he's fine, right?" Right, and so despite all of that, we get a Job who is not yet willing to criticize or push back against God. His wife even said, just curse God, be done with it. It's unclear why she says this. We're not given her sense of motivation. She hasn't been yet afflicted, although she has also lost children and experienced the economic loss that's hit the family. So there may be that. But we get no sense that she has cursed God. Well, that's a cultural issue, because we're dealing with a culture that largely only cares what the men do, right? Women and children just didn't have the same value. That's not to say they had no value; they just didn't have the same value. But then his friends come and they sit with him for 7 days, a week. We sort of get an allusion to sitting Shiva here, right? This man has suffered a great deal. His friends, when they come and they sit with him in silence for a long time. Anything else jump out? Any questions? Anything unusual about this? So what I find fascinating with this setup to this story, right, is, and this kind of gives us a hint that this whole setup, the whole story with the accuser and God and the language in the court, is really just context. It's just setting up the story. That's not the important component of the story that's happened. It's just explaining, it's just setting up the story that we're about to hear. And the reason why we know that is because we have a pattern. The accuser goes to God, gets permission to afflict Job, and then comes back and says, "Hey, see what happened?" And God and the accuser hash it out. Then the accuser does it again, and Job is afflicted. But from here on out, we won't hear from the accuser. We won't hear from Satan again. Satan never goes back and sits with God and says, "So I guess he still didn't turn over," or whatever. Instead, we're gonna follow Job for many days, talking with his friends. So we don't get the divine resolution between this debate between God and Satan, right? Which is intriguing. That suggests to us that that's really not the key to the story, what's going on in the divine court. It's more setup. Because if that's the story the author wants to tell about God and Satan, then we would expect to see this resolution to the debate, and we won't. So, chapter 3. How are we doing for time? We're good.
I'll go on.
Okay.
After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job said, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said, a man-child is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, for light shine on it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds settle upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Yes, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard in it. Let those who curse it, who curse the sea, those who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none. May it not see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, and hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why were there knees to receive me, or breasts for me to suck? Now I would be lying down in quiet, I would be asleep, then I would be at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth, who rebuild ruins for themselves, or with princes who have gold, who fill their houses with silver. Or why was I not buried like a stillborn child, like an infant that never sees the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They do not hear the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slaves are free from their masters. Why is light given to one in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in? For my sighing comes like my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. Truly the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes."
Okay, thank you. The it's kind of a depressing chapter, isn't it? Anything jumping out? We do get an interesting pattern. We open with him cursing the day of his birth, and we get a lot of language that suggests that kind of alludes to suffering. He associates it with barrenness. He associates it with the sea, which in this culture is chaotic and violent and tremulous. But then he talks about death, and what's intriguing is things that are culturally positive characteristics he uses to describe death. Breasts, sleep, land, and gold and silver, right? Plenty and wealth. In many ways, a lot of the things that he's lost, because breasts are associated with nursing, and he's lost his children. Land, he's lost he's essentially lost the farm. He didn't lose the land itself, but he's lost the farm. And gold and silver, he's experienced economic loss. And so these things that are often seen as positives, he's associating with death, normally seen as a negative, but he's using that as almost a positive to highlight, gee, wouldn't death be great at this point, right? After all that he's suffered. It's interesting though, and he's done speaking for a moment, what we don't get, like we've had at the end of the previous two encounters, is a description of whether or not this constitutes Job sinning or rebelling against God, right? It's left ambiguous at this point. Does this, if you curse the day you were born, the day that God brought you into the world, and you wish for death, is that cursing God? Not directly, but some might say that's pretty close to cursing God directly, right? And even though the author has previously given us a clear answer to that, to whether or not Job has done wrong, we don't get that this time. It is interesting that in verse 23, he notes, why is light, good things, given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in. That's the same language the accuser uses to describe Job at the very beginning. You fenced him in. You've protected him all this time. Job pretty much acknowledges this here. Like, gee, my life suffers, and it's only in this moment of extreme suffering that he realizes the privilege that his life held, right? Which is not uncommon of a characteristic with privilege. We often don't see how well off we are until we lose it, or until we experience suffering. And sometimes that can come in the experiencing of others' suffering. We can see what we have in context when we see somebody else who's suffering because they don't have the privilege we have. But here Job learns it through the personal experience of losing it. Again, it's interesting how some of these relatively modern concepts still show up in ancient texts. All right, would someone read Eliphaz's response to Job? It's worth noting that Eliphaz does show up elsewhere in Scripture, and he is noted in Scripture as being particularly wise. So, for people who are real familiar with the Hebrew Bible, they're likely to hear Eliphaz and go, "Oh, now we're going to get a wisdom response to what he's saying." So, what's wisdom's response?
I'll read that one.
Okay.
If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you and you are discouraged. It strikes you and you are dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence, and your blameless ways your hope? Consider now who being innocent has ever perished. Where were the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed those who plow evil, and those who sow trouble reap it. At the breath of God they perish, at the blast of his anger they are no more. The lions may roar and growl, yet the teeth of the great lions are broken. The lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lioness are scattered. A word was secretly brought to me, my ears caught a whisper of it. Amid disquieting dreams in the night, where deep sleep falls on people, fear and trembling seized me and made all my bones shake. A spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my body stood on end. It stopped, but I could not tell what it was. A form stood before my eyes, and I heard a hushed voice. Can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can even a strong man be more pure than his Maker? If God places no trust in his servants, if he charges his angels with care, how much more those who live in house of clay, whose foundations are in the dust, who are crushed more readily than a moth. Between dawn and dusk they are broken to pieces. Unnoticed they perish forever. Are not the cords of their tents pulled up so that they die without wisdom?
Okay, thank you. So, can you summarize Eliphaz's response? What's he telling Job?
Be faithful.
Yeah, he's definitely saying be faithful. So the first,
Because basically what I'm reading hearing is be faithful because in the end, God will be just.
Right. Not just. Well, yeah, just in the sense that, like wisdom, we talked about this right at the beginning. Like wisdom usually teaches, look, good people get good things and bad people get bad things. That's just the way it works. You know this, right? That's what he's saying in the middle of this chapter. He starts by criticizing Job, essentially saying, what are you complaining about? You tell people who suffer to suck it up, buttercup. That's what you need to do too. I mean, that's essentially, the opening of this passage actually matches very closely to the language of the Greek Stoics. So, just, you endure and you move on, right? Be stoic. Just get on with things. Suck it up, buttercup. But then he goes on to say, now think about it. We already know, because we're wise people, that good people get good things and bad people get punished, and that's just the way it is, right? Which is what he's suggesting. It is worth noting, because we're in a Lutheran church, verse 17 is one that Luther dwelled on, because Luther thought Satan tormented him a lot. Can mortals be righteous before God? Can human beings be pure before the Maker? Which I think could be one of the key verses to this last section of what he's saying to Job, which is he's alluding to the idea that, Job, you're not as good as you think you are. That's what he's suggesting, which of course, what we know of Job's story so far is that he hasn't done anything wrong, right? He's been faithful and good and decent, and God has considered him ideal up to this point. And yet his friend Eliphaz, who is wise, is kind of suggesting, you're suffering something from God. You must not be as good as you think you are. Right? That's wisdom's response to the situation. If a person is suffering, they must have done something wrong. Which follows from his logic of justice is good people get good things and bad people get punished. Right? Now, I don't know so I have, and this is the printer's edition, Mike chapter 5. Oh, before we do chapter 5, any questions? My copy had a little intro to this. You know how sometimes you get a little header on sections of text that says, Job is corrected by God. Does anybody else have that?
No.
Yeah, okay, so some of them. That's, if it's in your personal Bible, scratch that out. There's no indication I believe there's no indication in here that this is actually God speaking. The text would seem to suggest this is actually Eliphaz continuing. But we like to insert things in our interpretations into our text sometimes. So would someone pick up with chapter 5? Oh, you know what? There's 4 of you. I'll read 5. That's only fair. Call now. Is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? Surely vexation kills the fool, and jealousy slays the simple. I have seen fools taking root, but suddenly I cursed their dwelling. Their children are far from safety. They are crushed in the gate, and there is no one to deliver them. The hungry eat their harvest, and they take it even out of the thorns. And the thirsty pant after their wealth. For misery does not come from the earth, nor does trouble sprout from the ground. But human beings are born to trouble, just as sparks fly upward. As for me, I would seek God. It's worth noting that, notice that headline says, Job is corrected by God. That's kind of weird for God to say, I would seek God. Okay, as for me, I would seek God, and to God I would commit my cause. He does great things, and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. He gives rain on the earth, and sends waters on the fields. He sets on high those who are lowly, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. He frustrates the devices of the crafty, so that their hands achieve no success. He takes the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to the quick end. They meet with darkness in the daytime, and grope at noonday as in the night. But he saves the needy from the sword of their mouth, from the hand of the mighty. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts the mouth. How happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore, do not despise the discipline of the Almighty. For he wounds, but he binds up. He strikes, but his hands heal. He will deliver you from 6 troubles. In 7 no harm shall touch you. In famine he will redeem you from death, and in war from the power of the sword. You shall be hidden from the scourge of the tongue, and shall not fear destruction when it comes. At destruction and famine you shall laugh, and shall not fear the wild animals of the earth. For you shall be in league with the stones of the field, and the wild animals shall be at peace with you. You shall know that your tent is safe. You shall inspect your field and miss nothing. You shall know that your descendants will be many, and your offspring like the grass of the earth. You shall come to your grave in ripe old age, as the shock of grain comes up to the threshing floor in its season. See, we have searched this out. It is true. Hear and know it for yourself. Fits with the teaching of wisdom literature, right? I mean, this is more of Eliphaz's argument. We get a lot of the classic wisdom literature again. Good happens to good people, bad people get punished, and he even concludes, we know this to be true because we've searched it out, right? He's saying, look, I Googled it, I went on the internet, and I did my research. But what is it he's actually telling Job to do? Setting aside the wisdom literature, right? What's he saying to do? Just call out. Call on the holy ones. Who are you going to turn to, right? That's how he opens this up. And he goes on to kind of allude to, look, I've seen how foolish this takes its roots. He's essentially saying to Job, look, you're being a fool. And he goes on, as for me, I would seek God and I would commit my cause. This is verse 8. Because he does great things and unsearchable and marvelous. Okay. Again, he's kind of pushing that idea that Job must have done something wrong. Job, turn to God. Commit yourself to God's cause. As far as we know at this point, Job is still committed and faithful to God. When there's the passage where he curses his birth, we're kind of ambiguous about that. That's maybe not so clear. But Eliphaz definitely seems to think that Job has done something wrong that has caused him to deserve the punishment he's gotten. And therefore, he has to do something about it. That fits pretty heavily with the Hebrew Bible as a whole, right? In that there's a tendency when Israel experiences suffering, when an army runs them over or whatever, to immediately go, we must have done something wrong, we have to correct that. So that's the traditional wisdom of the culture, and it's the wisdom that Eliphaz is emphasizing.
So who's the voice of 5? Is it God?
I think it's Eliphaz. I think Eliphaz has continued to talk, and one of the things we'll see is if we kind of look ahead, you'll see that oftentimes Job and his friends get about 1 or 2 chapters each before somebody else jumps in and speaks. There's exceptions to that, but it's right about 1 or 2 chapters worth. And I don't know why anybody titles this Job is corrected by God, because we have at the beginning of 4, it says, then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, and he said blah 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 blah. And then when we go from 4 to 5, there's no transition. There's nothing that says.
Well, I guess that's what I'm asking you, is from what it says there, and this is a little bit different than 4, and the question is it God's word through Eliphaz, and therefore really God's word?
Well, there's nothing in the text to suggest that. This is, especially when you look at the references to God and to the divine. I mean, at first it sounds like maybe it could be because he's saying, like, call now. Is there anyone who will answer you? To which of the holy ones will you turn? Which, I mean, if this is God speaking, usually that kind of language would come in a more directed, like, you need to turn to God, right? Not who are you going to call, but call on God. And then in 8 we get we get a very human response, not so much a divine one. As for me, you know what I would do if I were in your shoes, right? And when we get the prophets who are told by God, I'm going to give you these words to say, they're usually a lot more forceful. It's not, if I were in your shoes, you know what I think I would do?
I find 6 and 7 very interesting, because basically I read that as or sort of like original sin. I mean, man is born into sin.
Original sin is messy, complicated.
Yeah, no, I understand, but I read this, and man is born into sin. It doesn't come from anything else. It just comes from the fact that you're man.
So 6 and 7.
And so does that go back to the fruit of the Garden of Eden? The forbidden fruit?
Probably not, because the idea that human sin that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden is a fairly modern Christian idea, and we're in the Hebrew Bible here, so not likely. So 6 and 7, I just want to read these before we discuss them. For misery does not come from the earth, nor does trouble sprout from the ground, but human beings are born to trouble just as sparks fly upwards. Could also be as birds fly upward. The Hebrew here is actually the sons of Resheph, whatever that means. I don't think this is necessarily. I don't know that born to trouble is necessarily suggesting the idea of born with original sin, so much as it is suggesting it's in their nature. And the comparison that just as sparks or birds fly upward is what gives us that sort of clarification on what's meant here.
Basically it's saying man is bad just like the fire throws sparks in the air.
Yeah,
It's just your nature.
It's nature, yeah. It's not, yeah. The concept of original sin is more along the lines of we were made to be one way, but we're born with something that we're not supposed to be. Original sin is not human nature. It's the curse that we carry with us, essentially. That's oversimplification, but yeah, no. This implies that it's human beings who screw things up. It's in our nature to make mistakes, to be sinful. It doesn't happen to us, because where would all of that come from if it didn't come from human beings? Which is a really compelling argument in the debate about human suffering within a religious understanding of the world in the modern context. That's often where those debates go to, is does God create suffering, or what is the cause of suffering? And a lot of times modern debates will ask the question of, well, first we have to root out how much of human suffering is the product of human behavior. And when we start digging deep into that, turns out it's a lot of it. And we're not just talking about direct human violence and war, but there are consequences to the world for our actions and for our inaction that contribute to those things. And I think that's more along the lines of what Eliphaz is pushing at here. And within the context of responding to Job, again, this is him trying to say, look, it's human nature to screw up and be sinful. You need to confess, essentially, is what he's saying. Admit it, you've done something wrong. He's being very flowery. He's using a lot of wisdom language to say it. But essentially, he's critiquing Job. Because Job in 3 is essentially saying, I should have never been born if this is the kind of suffering my life is going to be, right? Like, essentially he's saying, I didn't deserve this. And this is Eliphaz's response of, well, you must have deserved it. Because I know how wisdom works. That's essentially what he's saying. He's saying it in nice ways, but can you imagine telling somebody that, hey, I know you just lost the farm and all your kids and a whole bunch of other people you care about, and it all happened all at once. That was pretty tragic. And then you got this really horrible, debilitating disease that covered every inch of your skin. But you know what? You deserved it.
So the next translation of the Bible, written for the social media era,
Okay?
27 is going to say, like you said,
Yeah.
lo, we have Googled it, and it is true.
I mean, yeah. Eliphaz is an example of wisdom. And if you remember back to Ecclesiastes, which we read not that long ago, that's how Ecclesiastes starts out. Look, I looked out at the world and I saw all of this, and so what did I do? I searched it out. I did my own study. I researched it. I went and looked. I went and studied it out. This is what Eliphaz is saying at the end of his expression. We have searched it out. We've done the research to find out what is truth, what is true. Hear and know it for yourself, right? You need to listen to me because I know wisdom, right? So right away we get wisdom's response to Job. Where we are right at the end of our time, and I think it might be good to pick up Job's response at the start. We're going to get a couple chapters of Job, and we'll get Bildad's response. Get to find out what another one of his friends says, and we might squeeze in a little more of Job before the end of our next session. But we're going to close there with the Lord's Prayer. We will pick up in chapter 6 next week. So, let's pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you all next week, and thanks for watching us after the fact, and hope to see you again later.